They said the Grand Magnolia Hotel had never looked more beautiful. Chandeliers poured gold over marble floors. White roses breathed their perfume into the air, and crystal glasses chimed like tiny bells under the laughter of Atlanta's most polished elite. It was the kind of wedding people wrote about in magazines, where every smile was rehearsed, every step choreographed. But beauty can hide poison. And in the middle of that glittering perfection, a storm was about to break. Adrian Williams stepped into the ballroom wearing the only suit he owned, black and carefully pressed, the kind that spoke of quiet dignity rather than wealth. 31 now, he had built a life far from the city that had once tried to erase him. He worked with his hands, measuring, cutting, stitching fabrics, and teaching those skills to young people who, like him, had been cast aside. Every day had been about survival, about carving out a place in a world that preferred he disappear. Yet tonight was not about his own life. It was about the one person who had once been his whole world, Darius, his younger brother, the boy he had sworn to protect when they were children, huddled under the same worn blanket. The boy he hadn't seen in years, not since the day the family tore them apart. Now, Darius stood at the altar, the picture of success in a tailored suit, smiling at the woman by his side. Adrian had not come to offer blessings. He had come because he knew something no one else here did. And if he stayed silent, the marriage unfolding before his eyes would not be a beginning. It would be a trap. Briana, the bride, was radiant in her lace gown, her diamond tiara catching the chandelier light in sharp, cold flashes. She spotted Adrian almost immediately. Her gaze swept over him like a blade, and in that single glance, she decided he didn't belong. With a voice as crisp as breaking glass, she called to security. "Get this homeless-looking man out of here before he ruins my special day." The words sliced through the music, drawing stares and whispers from every corner of the ballroom. Adrian didn't move. He didn't raise his voice or defend himself. The insult washed over him, but his eyes never left Darius. And that was when it happened. Darius froze, his smile faltering as his gaze locked onto the faint crescent-shaped scar above Adrian's left eyebrow. A mark left from the night Adrian had shielded him from a stray dog's attack, back when love meant nothing more than staying alive together. Around them, the room hummed with confusion. Guests leaned toward each other, asking who this man was, why the groom looked as if he'd seen a ghost. No one here knew the truth. The man they were staring at was supposed to be dead. Years ago, Adrian had vanished from every family record, his name spoken only in past tense. And now, without warning, he was here breathing, unshaken, staring down the woman who had just tried to erase him. Briana's face hardened, but Adrian's thoughts were far away. He remembered the promise he had made to himself on the day he walked away from everything if he ever returned. It would be for a reason that mattered. Tonight was that reason. He could already feel the clock ticking. There would be no second chance. He had one goal: to stop his brother from walking into a life built on lies. You're listening to Heart Stories, where the stories are raw, human, and unforgettable. If this moment has already pulled you in, make sure to follow so you won't miss what happens when the truth finally breaks the surface. Because in this wedding, the vows aren't the only thing about to be broken. Sometimes life puts you back in the room you once fled, not to remind you of the pain, but to give you the chance to rewrite how it ends. And Adrian was ready to write his ending. 15 years earlier, the night smelled of rain and something far more dangerous. A thin mist rolled through the narrow street where Adrian Williams stood, his shirt clinging to his back, one arm wrapped around his younger brother Darius. The world had just fallen apart, both their parents gone in a silent tragedy, poisoned by invisible gas that leaked into the house as they slept. The sirens had faded hours ago, leaving only the sound of rain hitting the cracked pavement. Adrian, 16 and far too young to be anyone's guardian, had made a promise under that storm. No matter how hard the road became, he would protect Darius. He tightened the blanket around the boy's small frame, felt the tremor of his shivering, and silently vowed they would never be separated. But promises are fragile things when greed enters the room. The next day, their Uncle Jerome and Aunt Patricia arrived, their voices lined with sympathy but their eyes sharp with calculation. They spoke of laws and legal guardianship, of how children couldn't inherit property without proper oversight. Their words masked an intent Adrian could see too clearly. They wanted the house, the savings, the land, and they wanted the brothers apart. By the end of that week, the locks on the family home had been changed. Adrian and Darius were sent away from the only place they had ever called home. Jerome took Darius with him to a better life in the city, promising education and stability, while Patricia stood on the porch watching Adrian walk down the road alone. Life after that became a grinding cycle of survival. Adrian worked until his hands bled 3 jobs in a day, sleeping wherever he could, sometimes on a sofa borrowed from someone barely better off than himself. He learned to mend clothes, then to design and sew them, not for glamour, but for the currency of survival. Every cent he could spare, he sent to cover Darius's school expenses, making sure his brother never lacked what he himself had been denied. Darius grew, studied, and spoke of dreams over the occasional phone call they managed to steal from the disapproving eyes of their relatives. His dream was simple but powerful, to become an architect who would build homes for families who had none. Adrian clung to that dream like a lifeline. One evening, sorting through a box of their mother's old things stored in a friend's attic, Adrian found a brittle envelope sealed with their grandfather's initials. Inside lay the deed to 20 acres of land, inherited from their great-grandfather, a quiet stretch of earth that, unknown to most, sat atop a reservoir of oil worth billions. The deed was clear: the land belonged only to the blood children of their father. But secrets have a way of leaking, and Jerome learned of the discovery before Adrian could decide what to do. One night, footsteps followed him home. Shadows moved in corners where no light fell. The men who cornered him didn't ask questions, they acted. The plan was simple: make Adrian disappear, erase the problem forever. What they hadn't counted on was Miguel, a man with his own history of debts and loyalty. Years earlier, Adrian had helped Miguel's young daughter with clothes and school supplies when no one else would. That act, small at the time, became the reason Miguel stepped in, scattering the attackers and spiriting Adrian away into the dark. For the next 3 years, Adrian lived as if he no longer existed, hiding in Chicago, working quietly, never sending word to Darius. The absence was a wound he carried in silence. Watching from afar, he saw his brother's life unfold in photographs, heard whispers through mutual contacts, but never reached out. Safety demanded distance. Sometimes, the cruelest part of survival is the stillness it forces. Adrian had survived. But survival without those you love feels less like victory and more like a sentence you never agreed to serve. Years passed before Adrian Williams allowed himself to be more than a shadow in his brother's life. In his small Chicago apartment, he had learned to exist quietly, avoiding the streets where danger might recognize him. But the world had a way of pulling the past forward. One evening, scrolling through a mutual acquaintance's social media, Adrian saw a photograph that froze him in place: Darius at a charity gala, a striking woman at his side. The caption named her Briana, the daughter of a business partner tied to Jerome's long-standing ventures. The timing chilled him. She had appeared in Darius's life only months after Adrian's supposed death. The more he learned, the clearer the pattern became. Briana's family stood to gain access to any assets Darius inherited, particularly the oil-rich land Adrian had once discovered. Marriage would give her that access. Divorce could split the rights and funnel control straight back to Jerome. It was not a love story, it was a transaction with flowers and champagne to hide the ledger underneath. Adrian reached out to Miguel for the first time in years. The man had aged, but his loyalty had not. Together, they began collecting proof copies of financial statements, preliminary drafts of a prenuptial agreement that subtly shifted asset control, and, most damning of all, an audio recording. In it, Briana and Jerome discussed not only the planned acquisition of the land, but also the problem of Adrian's earlier survival. The conversation ended with Jerome's cold assurance that problem solved itself years ago. On the day of the wedding, the Grand Magnolia Hotel was dressed in opulence. Guests admired the floral arrangements, The live quartet, the endless trays of champagne. Beneath the glitter, Adrian felt the air tighten as he stepped through the entrance. Conversations dipped into whispers. Faces turned. Few here knew him, but the ones who did thought they were seeing an impossibility. From the far end of the aisle, Darius's eyes locked on his. A flicker of confusion gave way to recognition, then to something rawer memory. That crescent-shaped scar above Adrian's eyebrow anchored the truth. The man the family had buried in stories was standing in his wedding hall. The music faltered, replaced by an uneasy silence. Adrian moved forward, not toward a seat, but toward the microphone set up for speeches. He began not with accusations, but with the truth of who he was. His voice steady over the room's shifting murmurs. He spoke of their parents, of the day they were torn apart, and of the land their father's bloodline had left to them. Then came the evidence documents projected onto a screen, the prenuptial clauses, the recorded voices plotting behind closed doors. For the weight of the revelations settled, the ballroom doors opened again. Miguel entered, flanked by federal agents. Their presence was not theatrical. It was the next chapter of a long investigation. Jerome, Briana, and two associates were escorted out in a silence more crushing than any outburst could be. In the center of the room, Darius stood motionless until Adrian reached him. And then, after years of distance, they embraced. It was not the same as before time had changed them, but it was enough to remind both of the bond that had survived absence, lies, and death in all but name. Sometimes the people who claim to celebrate you are the same ones who plan your undoing. And sometimes the greatest act of love is not letting someone walk blind into a cage, no matter how gilded it looks. The weeks after the arrest were filled with courtrooms and paperwork. For the first time in over a decade, Adrian and Darius stood on the same side of a legal fight, their names linked in documents that restored what had been taken. The oil-rich land was officially returned to them. No longer a rumor whispered in shadows, but a tangible inheritance. The lawsuit against Jerome and his associates concluded in their favor, and the settlement included a share of profits from years of unauthorized extraction. Wealth, once an abstract idea, became a reality almost overnight. The first checks were larger than either of them had imagined. Adrian invested his share into creating a vocational center for underprivileged youth in the LGBT community, a place where skill and opportunity could change the trajectory of a life. He poured himself into the work, designing courses, hiring mentors, and ensuring no one was turned away for lack of resources. Darius's path took a different shape. He founded an architecture firm specializing in affordable housing, a dream they had spoken of in their youth. At first, the projects were modest but impactful, small clusters of homes in struggling neighborhoods, built with care rather than speed. Adrian admired the work, proud of the way his brother was giving form to the promises of their childhood. But success carries its own shadows. Within a year, Darius's name began appearing in industry magazines. Praise for his innovation and leadership. Invitations came from powerful corporate players, and with them, new offers, larger projects, larger profits. Among these was Blackstone Energy, a multinational with a reputation Adrian found troubling. Their proposal to lease part of the oil land for expanded drilling, in exchange for a sum that would eclipse anything the brothers had earned so far. Adrian read the contract and saw more than dollar signs. He saw the environmental risks, the clauses that shifted liability away from the company, and the creeping influence such a partnership would grant. When he confronted Darius, the conversation turned sharp. Darius dismissed his concerns, saying Adrian didn't understand the scale of opportunity and that his background in tailoring and community work didn't qualify him to judge corporate deals. The words landed like blows. For all they had endured together, the distance between them had returned, this time not forced by outsiders, but by pride and differing visions. The disagreement spiraled into a legal dispute over the land's ownership structure. In the courtroom, Darius argued for majority control, citing his role in expanding their wealth. Adrian fought to maintain joint authority, but the verdict favored Darius. leaving Adrian with only a small percentage of profits and no voice in future decisions. The fracture was final. They stopped attending each other's events. Their conversations reduced to curt messages about business obligations. The bond rebuilt after the wedding had thinned to a fragile thread, pulled taut by ambition on one side and conviction on the other. Power, Adrian realized, does not always corrupt in loud, dramatic strokes. Sometimes it slips in quietly, disguised as progress, until it rewrites the way you see the people who once held you together. And in families, the loss it leaves behind is harder to measure than any financial ledger can show. The call came just past midnight. Adrian Williams woke to the sharp vibration of his phone on the bedside table. Darius's name glowed on the screen, a rare occurrence after months of silence. His voice, when it came, was stripped of its usual confidence, trembling, hurried. He admitted what Adrian had suspected all along. Blackstone Energy's operation was more than just oil extraction. The land was being used to launder money, and now the company's reach extended beyond contracts. There had been threats, and this time they were personal. Adrian didn't ask questions. He promised he would be there. By the time he reached the site, dawn was still hours away. The compound was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt staged. Then he saw it, Darius's SUV parked near the edge of the reservoir. Its headlights were off, one door hanging slightly ajar. The ground sloped toward the murky water, and at the bottom of that slope, under the dim spill of a security lamp, lay his brother. The water lapped gently against the shore, carrying the weight of a body that should have been walking, breathing, speaking. Adrian ran, but there was nothing left to save. Bruises marked Darius's face and arms, the kind no accidental fall would cause. He knelt there, his hands trembling. Not from the cold, but from the recognition of what had been taken, not just life, but the chance for the two of them to find their way back. The official report came quickly, an accidental slip. No evidence of foul play. Adrian listened to the words, but heard only the hollow spaces between them. The FBI agent who had once helped them admitted, off record, that without concrete proof, Blackstone's contracts made prosecution impossible. The funeral was brief, dignified, attended by colleagues, acquaintances, and the few family members who had not chosen sides. Adrian stood apart, letting the condolences pass over him like rain on stone. Grief was no longer a sharp blade, but a deep weight, settling into his chest. In the months that followed, he dismantled the larger ventures they had built together. The oil land remained under lease for the remainder of the contract. But Adrian took what remained of his share and created a smaller, quieter fund, one dedicated to supporting young people from the LGBT community and low-income families. No press releases, no grand openings, just steady, deliberate help. One afternoon, while going through Darius's office to organize his papers, Adrian found a worn portfolio. Inside, among sketches of buildings and layouts, was a design for a community housing complex. At the corner of the page, in Darius's handwriting, were the words, "For my first home for you, when we are free again." The date was recent, drawn only months before his death. The realization hit with equal parts ache and gratitude. Even as ambition had pulled them apart, something in Darius had held on to the promise they made as children under that rain-soaked night sky. Adrian commissioned a group of LGBT architects to bring the design to life, building it on the remaining piece of family land untouched by corporate hands. When the first families moved in, the sun set over the rooftops just as it had that night years ago. Adrian stood in the courtyard, watching lights flicker on in windows, knowing that in some way, Darius's promise had been kept. Sometimes love survives where understanding fails. And sometimes the real inheritance is not the land or the wealth, but the pieces of each other we choose to carry forward. What would you have done if you were Adrian, holding both grief and the power to finish what your brother started? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, follow Heart Stories for more true-to-life tales that linger long after they end.